Somewhere in a spreadsheet in Washington, D.C. sits a number so big that most people's brains just slide right past it without actually processing it. $34 trillion. Say it slowly. $34 trillion. Now here is a line that economists who build fiscal models for a living use to describe what that number really means for the country you live in right now. They say the fiscal situation of the United States is a 350-pound, 2-pack-a-day smoker sitting on an ICU table. Not dead, not even diagnosed yet. Just sitting there hooked up to monitors while every single reading says catastrophe is coming and the patient reaches for another cigarette anyway. I am not telling you this to scare you for views. I am telling you this because federal borrowing in America has now grown to roughly the size of the entire American economy. Every factory, every app, every restaurant, every paycheck, all of it matched dollar for dollar by debt. And by the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why serious people are using words like ICU table to describe the country's finances, what it means for your savings, your mortgage, your job, and your retirement, and you will understand it better than most people who work in finance for a living. Before you go anywhere, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel exists to translate exactly this kind of thing, the stuff that moves your money in the background while nobody explains it to you in plain English. And once you understand how this system actually works, you will never look at the news the same way again. My name is Dave Marshall, and I spend an unreasonable amount of my life reading the reports that most people scroll past. The 200-page releases from the Congressional Budget Office, the dense research notes from Treasury economists, the stuff written in a font size that seems specifically designed to make you give up. My job on this channel is to take that material and hand it to you in a form you can actually use. And I need you to stay with me for this one because what we're about to walk through together is not a Republican story or a Democrat story. It is math, cold, compounding, patient math. And math does not care who is in office, it just keeps a running total. Here is where the countdown actually starts. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania built something called the Wharton fiscal model, and it is not some hot take from a finance account online. It is a real simulation of the American economy built and maintained by professional economists, including one named Kent Smetters, who has spent years running this exact scenario over and over again. And what the model shows is not comfortable. If the federal government does not change its current path of spending and borrowing, the model suggests the U.S. bond market, the market where the government actually raises the money it spends by selling something called treasuries, could hit a genuine breaking point within roughly the next 20 years, not 100 years from now. Not some far-off future your great-grandchildren will deal with. 20 years, that is one mortgage. That is a baby born this year walking across a college graduation stage someday. Economists have a specific term for this moment. They call it the tipping point, the exact spot where confidence quietly turns into panic, and once you cross it, there is no polite way back. Keep that number, 20 years, in the back of your mind, because we are going to come back to that clock more than once tonight. So how did a 350-pound smoker end up on that ICU table in the first place? It starts with something so simple it almost sounds boring, and that is exactly why most people ignore it. Every year, the United States government spends more money than it collects in taxes. That gap has a name, deficit spending, and when your household runs a deficit, you cover it by pulling out a credit card or borrowing from a relative. When the United States government runs a deficit, it covers the gap by selling treasuries, essentially IOUs backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government to investors, banks, pension funds, and foreign governments, basically anyone willing to lend Washington money in exchange for regular interest payments. For decades, this worked fine because the world's appetite for these treasuries seemed endless. Everyone wanted a piece of the safest, most trusted debt on the planet. But here is the part that should make you sit up a little straighter. Deficits are not a one-time event, they stack. Every year the government spends more than it takes in. That gap gets added on top of every previous gap, compounding year after year, decade after decade, until you get a running total of national debt that has now blown past $34 trillion. And unlike your mortgage, which eventually gets paid off, this debt keeps rolling over, meaning old debt gets paid off by issuing brand new debt. It is a financial treadmill that never stops, and the treadmill only becomes a real problem the moment investors start asking an uncomfortable question. What happens if the borrower can no longer keep up? That question is exactly where our story goes next, because the answer involves a trick the U.S. government has that almost no ordinary household has access to, and it comes with a hidden cost that shows up in your grocery bill before it ever shows up anywhere else. Here is the trick. Unlike Greece back in 2010, unlike Argentina more times than anyone can count, the United States borrows money in its own currency, the U.S. dollar. That single fact means America is very unlikely to technically default on its debt, because in theory the government can always print more dollars to cover what it owes. That sounds like a loophole, almost like a cheat code, but it is not free. It is what I like to call the inflation escape hatch, because pulling that lever does not make the problem disappear, it just changes what form the problem takes. When you dramatically increase the money supply, meaning the total amount of dollars floating around the economy, without a matching increase in actual goods and services, you get more dollars chasing the same number of products. And when more dollars chase the same amount of stuff, prices go up. That is inflation, and inflation is really just a quiet tax. Nobody votes on it. Nobody debates it in Congress with cameras rolling. It just shows up, a little at a time, in your grocery bill, your rent, your car payment, your electric bill, silently transferring purchasing power away from regular savers and workers and toward the government that just paid off its old debt with cheaper dollars. Think about that for a second. The national debt does not need to be defaulted on to hurt you. It can hurt you just by being financed through the printing press, because every dollar you have saved quietly buys a little less than it used to. This is not some fringe economic theory. This is basic supply and demand applied to the most important product in the entire economy, the US dollar itself. And here is the uncomfortable truth investors like Ray Dalio have spent years warning about. You cannot use debt to get out of a debt problem. You can only move the pain around from the government's balance sheet onto your grocery receipt. So if printing money is the quiet escape hatch, what stops the government from just doing that forever? 2 words: bond vigilantes. This term was coined by a well-known Wall Street economist named Ed Yardeni, and it describes a very specific and very powerful group of people, the investors who buy and sell government bonds for a living. Here is how the mechanism works. When these investors start to lose confidence that a government is managing its finances responsibly, they do not write an angry letter to Congress. They simply start selling. They dump government bonds on the open market, and when bond prices fall, the interest rate the government has to pay on new debt automatically rises, because nobody wants to lend money to a shaky borrower for cheap. In other words, the bond market itself becomes judge, jury, and enforcer, punishing reckless fiscal policy in real time, often faster than any election ever could. This is not a new phenomenon. Robert Rubin, who served as Treasury Secretary in the 1990s, watched this exact dynamic play out up close, when growing concern about deficits pushed interest rates higher and forced policymakers to take deficit reduction seriously, years before anyone had even coined the term bond vigilantes. The lesson from that era was simple. The bond market does not care about your 5-year plan or your talking points. It cares about one thing: will I get paid back in dollars that are still worth something? There is a related idea economists call the term premium, which is basically the extra interest rate investors demand to lend money over a longer period of time, as compensation for the added risk and uncertainty of the future. When confidence in a government's fiscal path weakens, that term premium creeps higher and borrowing costs rise across the entire economy, not just for the government but for everyone, because Treasury yields act like the baseline interest rate that every other loan in America gets priced against. Your mortgage rate, your car loan, your business's credit line. All of it quietly connected to the same bond market that Ed Yardeni's vigilantes patrol every single day. And once those vigilantes decide to show up in force, they do not politely negotiate. They strike fast and they strike hard. Which brings us to a real story, one that did not happen in some distant emerging market, but in one of the most developed economies on Earth, and it happened in 6 weeks. In September of 2022, the United Kingdom got a brand new Prime Minister named Liz Truss. Within days of taking office, her government announced a sweeping economic plan built around roughly £45 billion of tax cuts. And here is the critical detail that made bond vigilantes sit up in their chairs. Those tax cuts were unfunded, meaning there was no clear plan for how the government would pay for them, other than borrowing significantly more money. The market's reaction was not gradual, it was almost instant. Investors looked at that plan and essentially said, "We do not believe this math works, and we are not willing to lend you money on the same terms as before." The British pound dropped sharply against the dollar. Yields on UK government bonds, the British equivalent of treasuries, spiked violently within days. And here is the part that turned this from a headline into a genuine crisis. British pension funds, the retirement accounts millions of ordinary working people depended on, had used a common financial strategy that assumed government bond prices would stay relatively stable. When bond prices instead collapsed within days, many of these pension funds faced margin calls so severe that some were forced into panic selling, dumping even more bonds to raise emergency cash, which pushed bond prices down even further in a genuinely terrifying feedback loop. The Bank of England had to step in with emergency bond buying just to stop the spiral from spreading further into the broader financial system. Liz Truss's government tried to walk back parts of the plan, but the damage to market credibility was already done. Confidence, once broken like that, is brutally hard to rebuild. Within 6 weeks of taking office, Liz Truss resigned, becoming one of the shortest-serving prime ministers in British history. Now here is why this story matters to you, sitting in the United States watching a video on your phone. The United Kingdom is not some struggling emerging economy. It is a wealthy, developed, historically stable G7 nation with its own central bank and a long track record of paying its debts. And the bond vigilantes still turned on it in a matter of days once they decided the fiscal math simply did not add up. The United Kingdom did not get decades of warning. It got days. This is exactly why I keep bringing up this idea of the invisible dog fence. You know those underground fences some people use for their dogs, where there is no physical wall, no visible barrier, nothing the dog can see coming. The dog does not know exactly where the line is until it crosses it and feels the consequence immediately. Fiscal limits work the same way. There is no giant sign in the sky that says "Warning, debt limit reached." You do not know exactly where that invisible line sits until the bond market suddenly, violently, lets you know you have already crossed it. Now let us bring this back home, because the United States has its own version of that invisible fence, and unlike the United Kingdom's, ours does not depend on one risky announcement from a new leader. Ours is already baked into the math, growing quietly year after year. According to projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the government office responsible for scoring exactly this kind of thing, interest payments on the national debt in 2025 are projected to exceed what the federal government spends on Medicare, on Medicaid, and on national defense. Read that again. Not close to those categories combined, more than them. And these interest payments now consume more than 18% of total federal tax revenue, meaning for every dollar you and every other taxpayer send to Washington, roughly 18 cents goes straight out the door just to cover interest on debt already accumulated, before a single dollar gets spent on schools, roads, healthcare, or anything else. Economists call this the crowding out effect, because every dollar consumed by interest payments is a dollar that cannot be used for anything productive. It gets crowded out. And here is the trap nobody likes to talk about at dinner parties. This creates a dangerous loop. When you borrow more to fund a big new spending plan or a big new round of tax cuts, you are not just adding to the total debt, you are adding to the amount of interest the government owes every single year going forward, which increases future deficits, which requires even more borrowing, which increases interest costs again. It feeds itself. This is exactly the dynamic playing out around recent legislation like the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, the sweeping tax and spending package that current Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has had to defend and manage as it moves through the real economy. Supporters describe an ambitious vision for growth. Critics point straight back to the CBO's own math on what it does to the deficit. And regardless of which side of that argument you land on, here is the blunt reality the bond market does not care about. You might have a big, beautiful plan until you get punched in the face by a bond market that simply refuses to lend you money on the same cheap terms it used to. Ambitious plans do not repeal arithmetic. Arithmetic always eventually collects its bill, usually with interest attached. So far we have talked about markets and money, but there is a whole other layer to this story, and it is the one that should genuinely keep you up at night, because it is not just about your wallet, it is about America's power on the world stage. Here is a fact most people never think about. A meaningful chunk of U.S. government debt is not owned by Americans at all. It is owned by foreign governments, and Japan alone holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt, making it one of the largest foreign holders of American treasuries on the planet. Now Japan is a close, long-time ally, so that particular relationship is not the concerning part. The concerning part is what this dynamic reveals about a broader vulnerability. Countries like Russia and China have openly discussed America's mountain of debt as a strategic weak point, a potential piece of leverage in a rivalry playing out on far more fronts than most people realize. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping do not need to invade anyone to exploit a debt problem. They simply need patience, because a country that spends more and more of its own tax revenue just servicing interest payments has less and less flexibility to invest in its own military, its own infrastructure, and its own technological edge. There's also the question of the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, the default currency global trade and central banks have relied on for decades, which is precisely why America has been able to borrow so cheaply and so easily for so long. That status is not a birthright written into the laws of physics. It is a privilege that depends entirely on continued global confidence, The same confidence that gets tested every single time bond vigilantes start asking hard questions. Admiral Michael Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the entire United States Armed Forces at the time, went on record years ago arguing that the national debt itself, not any foreign army, was the single greatest threat to America's national security. Think about how remarkable that statement actually is. The top general in the country was not primarily worried about missiles or aircraft carriers. He was worried about a spreadsheet. This is what I call the superpower squeeze. As interest payments keep eating a bigger and bigger share of the federal budget, that spending has to come from somewhere, and it increasingly competes directly with the budget for national defense, the very thing that maintains America's position on the world stage. The debt burden draws in scarce resources, leaving a great power vulnerable exactly at the moment it can least afford to be. And there is one more piece to this puzzle. Tariffs, taxes placed on imported goods, have recently been floated as one tool to help generate additional government revenue and offset some of this borrowing. Tariff revenue can genuinely help at the margins, but here is the catch nobody advertises. Tariffs are ultimately paid by importers, and those costs typically flow through to consumers, meaning you in the form of higher prices on everyday goods. It is another version of that same quiet tax we talked about earlier with inflation, just wearing a different disguise, dressed up in the language of trade policy instead of monetary policy. Let us bring this all the way back to where we started. That image of a 350-pound two-pack-a-day smoker sitting on an ICU table, still not diagnosed, still lighting another cigarette. That is not a metaphor about some distant country. Economists using Wharton's own fiscal model, built by people like Kent Smetters, are describing the United States right now with a rough 20-year clock already ticking quietly in the background. We talked about deficit spending stacking year after year into a national debt now over $34 trillion. We talked about the inflation escape hatch, and how printing money to cover debt does not erase the problem. It just quietly transfers the pain onto your grocery bill and your savings account, because you genuinely cannot use debt to get out of a debt problem. You can only move the pain somewhere else. We talked about Ed Yardney's bond vigilantes, the investors who can punish reckless fiscal policy faster than any election, and we watched that exact mechanism topple a British Prime Minister's entire government in 6 weeks. We talked about interest payments now exceeding spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and national defense combined, consuming more than 18% of every tax dollar sent to Washington, an entitlement and defense squeeze that only gets tighter with each passing year. And we talked about the superpower squeeze, the way this entire domestic financial story quietly becomes a national security story, with rivals like Russia and China watching patiently, while a debt burden draws in America's own scarce resources and leaves a great power more vulnerable than most citizens ever realize. So where does that leave you? Not helpless and definitely not powerless, because understanding a system is always the first step toward protecting yourself inside it. This is exactly why I make videos like this one. Not to panic you, not to sell you gold coins in the next 10 seconds, but to make sure you actually understand the invisible fence you're living inside, long before you ever feel the shock of crossing it. If this video helped connect some dots for you, do 3 things right now. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next breakdown, because we are going to keep tracking that 20-year Wharton clock together, video after video, as it keeps ticking down. Hit the like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to actually understand their own money instead of just feeling anxious about it. And drop a comment telling me what part of this surprised you the most. The ICU line, the 6-week collapse of an entire British government, or that 18% number quietly eating your tax dollars before they ever reach a single school or road. I read every single one of them. I'm Dave Marshall, and I will see you in the next video, because this countdown is not over. It is just getting started.